Part 2, Section 2 of The Sinking of the Merrimac by Richmond Pearson Hobson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 2, The Run-In. Section 2, containing Making for the Entrance, The Firing Begins, Loss of the Steering Gear, Trouble with the Torpedoes, A Crisis off Estrella Point, Kelly's Narrow Escape, Beginning to Sink, Conversations on Deck, A Focus of Fire, The Final Plunge, In the Vortex, Clinging to the Catamaran, Admiral Cervera to the Rescue. The Merrimac was headed about west-southwest. The engine telegraph was turned to slow speed ahead, the helm was put a starboard, and we gathered headway and swung round by the southward and stood up slowly on the course. The moon was about an hour and a half high, and steering for the Morro, we were running straight down the reflected path of light. To clear this, we stood to the eastward of the course and crept along obliquely at about 4 knots. Charette was sent to see that all the men were equipped and the revolvers loaded. It took only a short time to strip off uniforms and put on revolver belts and life preservers. Charette soon came back and reported that all the men were equipped except the 2 below, who had stripped to breechcloths and who asked permission to leave their revolver belts and life preservers at the head of the hatch on account of the inconvenience of wearing them while working engines and boilers. As we stood on, the outlines of Morro and other shore objects became clearer and clearer. The blockading vessels were miles behind. When we arrived within about 2,000 yards, there could be no further question of surprise. In the bright moonlight, we were in clear view, and our movements must long since have caused suspicion. The enemy was now doubtless on the verge of sounding the general alarm, if indeed it had not already been sounded. The orders were full speed ahead, steady a starboard, and the engine telegraph recorded prompt execution. Degnan repeated in firm voice, "Steady a starboard, sir." The vessel responded as if animated. The foam began to fly from our anchors, which, slung over bow and quarter, just trailed in the water, and our bow swung round to the northward and westward. "Meet her," was the order. "Meet her, sir," was the reply. "Steady." "Steady, sir." We stood down toward the course for entering. Charette was sent below to tell Phillips and Kelly that we were on the final run, and that the signal to stop would be the signal to open up sea connections and then lay up on deck by the torpedoes, and both were directed to put on revolver belt and life preserver as soon as they reached the deck. Morro drew further to starboard. It bore north, then north by east, and then north-northeast. We must keep clear of the 2-fathom bank and not overreach to the westward. "Nothing to the westward." "Nothing to the westward, sir." "Morro bears northeast by north." "Port, port, sir." "Steady, steady, sir." Port a little, sir." "Morro bears northeast." "Steady, steady, sir." "Head for the Morro." "Head for the Morro, sir." The night glasses showed up Estrella. "Can you make out the white spot to the left of Morro?" "Yes, sir." "That is Estrella. Steer for Estrella." "Steer for Estrella, sir." The swell approaching the entrance might tend to set our stern to port. "Watch the helm." "Watch the helm, sir." "Do not let her yaw, but use only a gentle helm." "Aye, aye, sir." Degnan's whole thought was centered on his helm. He seemed to forestall any deviating tendency, and the heavy collier kept as straight as a handy yacht, and on we drove down the exact course. Morro drew higher in the sky, and the westward side of the entrance, though dim as expected, showed the bald spot of the sea battery on top. We were within 500 yards, and still no token from the enemy, though the silence was ominous. We should make the channel now, no matter what they might do. I knew how long the vessel carried headway. We were making nearly 9 knots, and soon the flood tide would help, while we had over 7,000 tons of reserve buoyancy, which would carry us the required distance even under a mortal wound. Another ship's length, and a flash darted out from the water's edge at the left side of the entrance. The expected crash through the ship's side did not follow, nor did the projectile pass over. It must have gone astern. Strange to miss at such short range. Another flash, another miss. This time the projectile plainly passed astern. Night glasses on the spot revealed a dark object, a picket boat with rapid-fire guns lying in the shadow. As sure as fate, he was firing at our rudder, and we should be obliged to pass him broadside within a ship's length. If we only had had a rapid-fire gun, we could have disposed of the miserable object in 10 seconds. Yet there he lay, unmolested, firing point-blank at our exposed rudder, so vital to complete success. A flash of rage and exasperation passed over me. The admiration due this gallant little picket boat did not come till afterward. Glasses on the starboard bow showed the sharp, steep, step-like fall with which the western point of Morro drops into the water. This was the looked-for guide, the channel carrying deep water right up to the wall. A touch of port helm was the order. A touch of port helm, sir, was the response. Steady, steady, sir. Now, even without helm, we should pass down safe. Suddenly there was a crash from the port side. The western battery has opened on us, sir, called Charette, who was still on the bridge, waiting to take the message to the engine room if telegraph and signal cord should be shot away. Very well, pay no attention to it, I replied, without turning. Morro Point on the starboard side required all attention. The latter part of the answer was spoken for the benefit of the helmsman. Mind your helm. Mind the helm, sir. Nothing to starboard. Nothing to starboard, sir. The clear, firm voice of Degnan told that there need be no fear of his distraction. I estimated the distance to Morro Point at about 3 ships' lengths, and wondered if the men below would stand till we covered another ship's length, 2 ships' lengths being the distance at which it had been decided to give the signal to stop. All of a sudden, whir, cling, came a projectile across the bridge and struck something. I looked. The engine telegraph was still there. Degnan and the binnacle were still standing. 2½ ships' lengths. 2 ships' lengths. Then over the engine telegraph went the order, "Stop." Sure and steady the answer pointer turned. There need have been no anxiety about the constancy of the brave men below. The engine stopped, and somehow I knew the sea connections were thrown open. This had been a puzzle to me ever since. For how could the bonnet flying off, or the axe blows on copper piping, or the inrush of water make enough noise or vibration to be heard or felt on the bridge, particularly with guns firing and projectiles striking? It may be that the condition of expectation and the fact of the fulfillment of the first part of the order suggested the conclusion, but sure I was that the connections were open and that the ship was beginning to settle. You may lay down to your torpedoes now, Charette. Aye, aye, sir. On the vessel forged, straight and sure the bow entered. Morro shut off the sky to the right. The firing now became general, but we were passing the crisis of navigation and could spare attention to nothing else. A swell seemed to set our stern to port, and the bow swung heavily toward Morro, which we had hugged close intentionally. Starboard, starboard, sir. Still we swung starboard. Starboard, I say. The helm's a starboard, sir. Our bow must have come within 30 feet of Morro Rock before the vessel began to recover from the sheer, and we passed it close aboard. Meet her, sir. The steering gear was still ours, and only about half a ship's length more, and we should be in the position chosen for the maneuver. The sky began to open up beyond Morro. There was the cove. Yes, there was the position. Hard a port, sir. No response of the ship. Hard a port, I say. The helm is hard a port, sir, and lashed. Very well, Degnan, I said. Lay down to your torpedo. Oh, heaven, our steering gear was gone, shot away at the last moment, and we were charging forward straight down the channel. It is difficult to state just how the steering gear was disabled. The Spanish lieutenant in charge of the picket boat claimed that he shot away the rudder and the whole stern structure. It is certain, however, that he had not done this up to a point within half a ship's length from the position where the helm was ordered to be put over. As referred to farther on, Montague reported a large projectile wrecking the stern structure as it cut the anchor lashing. This shell may have destroyed the rudder head in addition. Charette reported that when he was examining the torpedo connections after they had failed to fire, he noticed that the chain that led from the tiller to the wheel on the bridge along the upper deck had been shot away. The steering gear may have been disabled thus in any one or in all of these ways. We must have had 4 3/4 knots speed of our own, and the tide must have been fully a knot and a half. What ground tackle could hold against a mass of over 7,000 tons moving with a velocity of 6 knots? We stood on a little longer to reduce the speed further. A pull on Murphy's cord to stand by. 3 steady pulls. The bow anchor fell. A pause, then a shock, a muffled ring above the blast of guns. Torpedo number 1 had gone off promptly and surely, and I knew that the collision bulkhead was gone. If the bow chain in breaking would only give us a sheer, and the other torpedoes proved as sure, we should have but a short interval to float, and holding on to the stern anchor, letting go only at the last moment, we might still effectively block the channel. An interval elapsed and grew longer. No answer from torpedo number 2, none from number 3. Thereupon I crossed the bridge and shouted, "Fire all torpedoes!" My voice was drowned. Again and again I yelled the order, with hands over mouth, directing the sound forward, below, aft. It was useless. The rapid fire and machine gun batteries on Socapa slope had opened up at full blast, and projectiles were exploding and clanging. For noise, it was Niagara, magnified. Soon Charette came running up. "Torpedoes 2 and 3 will not fire, sir. The cells are shattered all over the deck." "Very well. Lay down and underrun all the others, beginning at number 4, and spring them as soon as possible." In a moment, number 5 went off with a fine ring. Degnan had waited for number 2 and number 3, and not hearing them had tried his own, but had found the connections broken and the cells shattered. He then went down to Clawson at number 5. No other torpedo responded. Number 6 and number 8 had suffered the same fate as numbers 2, 3, and 4. With only 2 exploded torpedoes, we should be some time sinking, and the stern anchor would be of first importance. I determined to go down aft and stand over to direct it personally, letting go at the opportune moment. Passing along the starboard gangway, I reached the rendezvous. Stepping over the men, they appeared to be all present. There was Charette, returned from a second attempt at the torpedoes. There could be no further hope from that quarter. And, there was Montague. The stern anchor, then, was already gone. If the chain was broken, we should have no further means of controlling our position. Looking over the bulwarks, I saw that we were just in front of Estrella, apparently motionless, lying about 2/3 athwart the channel, the bow to the westward. Could it be that the ground tackle had held? Then we should block the channel in spite of all. I watched, almost breathless, taking a range of the bow against the shoreline. The bow moved, the stern moved. Oh, heaven, the chains were gone. The tide was setting us down and would straighten us out if the stern should touch first. Oh, for the warheads to put her down at once. But we were helpless. I said nothing to Montague about having let go the stern anchor, indeed gave him no evidence of my chagrin, for he had been instructed that if no signal came from the bridge he should let go a short time after the torpedoes ceased going off. And moreover, the signal cord from the bridge had been broken. It was not until weeks after our exchange that I ventured a reference to the subject, when he told me that he had seen that we were not swinging athwart as expected, and had not let go the anchor himself, but that a large projectile coming from ahead over the port bow, apparently from a ship, had exploded aft, wrecking everything in the vicinity and cutting the lashing that held the anchor. There was nothing further to do but to accept the situation. We mustered, counting heads, and thought all were present. But we must have counted wrongly, for after a minute or two, Kelly came across the deck on all fours. He had done his duty below with promptness and precision, and had come on deck to stand by his torpedo. While putting on his life preserver, a large projectile had exploded close at hand. He thought against the mainmast, and he had been thrown with violence on the deck, face down, his upper lip being cut away on the right side. He must have lain there some little time unconscious, and had got up completely dazed, without memory. He looked on one side and then the other, saw the engine room hatch, the first object he recognized, and, under the force of habit, started down it, but found the way blocked by water, which had risen up around the cylinders. The sight of the water seemed to bring back memory, and soon the whole situation dawned upon him. He mounted again, and with heroic devotion went to his torpedo, only to find the cells and connections destroyed, when he started for the rendezvous. He had indeed brought his revolver belt so as to be in uniform, and adjusted it after reaching us. His reception must have seemed strange, for it was at the muzzle of my revolver. Thinking that our men were all at hand, it was a strange sensation to see a man come up on all fours, stealthily, as it seemed, from behind the hatch. Could they be boarding us so soon? My revolver covered him at once, and I looked to see if others followed. It was not until the revolver was almost in his face that the unusual uniform showed that the man was one of us. The idea of the Spaniards boarding us under the conditions seemed ridiculous the moment the man was accounted for, and the mental processes and the action taken must have belonged to the class of reflex or spontaneous phenomena. Charette told me that he also, when he saw the man, drew his revolver with the idea of repelling boarders. We were now moving bodily onward with the tide, Estrella Point being just ahead of the starboard quarter. A blasting shock, a lift, a pull, a series of vibrations, and a mine exploded directly beneath us. My heart leapt with exultation. Lads, they are helping us! I looked to see the deck break, but it still held. I looked over the side to see her settle at once, but the rate was only slightly increased. Then came the thought, could it be that the coal had deadened the shock and choked the breach, or had the breach been made just where we were already flooded by sea connection and torpedo number 5? A sense of indescribable disappointment swept over me. I looked again. No encouragement. But we had stopped. Estrella Point had caught us strong, and we were already sinking 2/3 athwart. The work was done, and the rest was only a question of time. We could now turn our attention toward the course of action to be taken next. Upon arriving at the rendezvous, I ordered that no man move till further orders, and repeated the order to Kelly when he arrived. The order had been obeyed without murmur. I then said to them, "We will remain here, lads, till the moon sets. When it is dark, we will go down the after hatch to the coal, where her stern will be left out of water. Some of us will come up and get the rifles and cartridges from the boat. We will remain inside all day, and tonight, at ebb tide, try to make our way to the squadron. If the enemy comes on board, we will remain quiet until he finds us, and will repel him. If he then turns artillery on the place where we are, we will swim out to points farther forward." Such were my plans when it seemed we should remain on Estrella Point and sink by the bow with the stern out. I added, "Remain as you are, lads. I'm going to take a turn to reconnoiter." I wanted to go forward to hoist the flag. "Please do not, sir," pleaded Charette when he discovered my intention. "If you go, they will see you and will see us all." He was right. It would be wrong to take the risk. There might be a better chance when it became dark. "Very well, then," I said, "I will not go." I looked over the bulwarks to observe again the speed of sinking and take note of the enemy's fire. "Here is a chock, sir, where you can look out without putting your head over the rail," called Charette. The hole was large, just above the deck, and well suited for observation. It was doubtless a valuable find of Charette's, for the patter of bullets had continued to increase, and now repeating rifles were firing down on us from Estrella just above. Footnote: While in prison, the men were told by Spanish soldiers that the troops of the 65th Regiment were lining the eastern side of the entrance, and troops of the 75th Regiment the western side, and the writer was informed by a Spanish army officer that troops were ordered in from far and near, a detachment from Santiago, of which he was a member, arriving only as the Merrimac sank. End of footnote. It is remarkable indeed that some of these men did not see us, for though the moon was low, it was bright, and there we were with white life preservers almost at the muzzles of their guns. The pouring out of ammunition into the ship at large must have prevented them from seeking special targets with deliberation. The deafening roar of artillery, however, came from the other side, just opposite our position. There were the rapid-fire guns of different calibers, the unmistakable Hotchkiss revolving cannon, the quick succession and pause of the Nordenfeldt multi-barrel, and the tireless automatic gun. Footnote: just after the surrender of Santiago, when I went in to assist Lieutenant Capehart, who was detailed to raise the mines, I took occasion to look at the batteries on Socapa, and found in place the following: in the C battery, two 16-centimeter (6.3-inch) breech-loading rapid-fire, and three 9-inch mortars, studded system, old pattern. On the slope opposite Estrella, one Nordenfeldt 57 mm rapid fire, one Nordenfeldt 4-barrel 25 mm, and four Hotchkiss 37 mm revolving cannon. There were emplacements from which guns had been removed, and it was impossible to tell what was the full strength of the battery when the Merrimac entered. I was informed that after the landing of United States troops, a general redistribution of artillery took place, guns placed along the entrance being transferred to the defense of the city. I was also informed that the batteries of the destroyers had been used ashore at the entrance, but had been put back on the boats before they left the harbor on July 3rd. It may be added that 8 observation mines were found to have been fired at the Merrimac, all of the 6 from the Estrella station, and 2 of the 6 from the Socapa station, leaving only 4, there being no material to replace the ones fired. Powell, in his report of his observations, speaks of seeing 7 simultaneous columns of water as from torpedoes. As only 2 of my torpedoes went off, and at different times, this would indicate that 6 of these must have been from the Estrella station mines. End of footnote. A deadly fire came from ahead, apparently from shipboard. These later projectiles would enter, explode, and rake us. Those passing over the spar deck would apparently pass through the deckhouse far enough away to cause them to explode just in front of us. All firing was at point-blank range, at a target that could hardly be missed, and Socapa batteries with plunging fire, the ship's batteries with horizontal fire. The striking projectiles and flying fragments produced a grinding sound with a fine ring in it of steel on steel. The deck vibrated heavily, and we felt the full effect lying, as we were, full length on our faces. At each instant, it seemed that certainly the next would bring a projectile among us. The impulse surged strong to get away from a place where remaining seemed death, and the men suggested taking to the boat and jumping overboard. But I knew that any object leaving the ship would be seen, and to be seen was certain death, and therefore I directed all to remain motionless. The test of discipline was severe, but not a man moved, not even when a projectile plunged into the boiler, and a rush of steam came up the deck not far from where we lay. The men expected a boiler explosion, but accepted my assurance that it would be only a steam escape. While lying thus, a singular physiological phenomenon occurred. After a few minutes, one of the men asked for the canteen, saying that his lips had begun to parch. Then another asked, then another, and it was passed about to all. Only a few minutes had elapsed when they all asked again, and I felt my own lips begin to parch and my mouth to get dry. It seemed very singular, so I felt my pulse and found it entirely normal, and took account of the state of the nervous system. It was, if anything, more phlegmatic than usual, observation and reason taking account of the conditions without the participation of the emotions. Projectiles, indeed, were every moment expected among us, but they would have been taken in the same way. Reason took account of probabilities, and according to the direction of the men's bodies with regard to the line of fire from the ship's guns, I waited to see one man's leg, another man's shoulder, the top of another man's head taken off. I looked for my own body to be cut in two diagonally, from the left hip upward, and wondered for a moment what the sensation would be. Not having pockets, tourniquets had been carried loosely around my left arm, and a roll of antiseptic lint was held in my left hand. These were placed in readiness. We must have remained thus for 8 or 10 minutes, while the guns fired ammunition as in a proving ground test for speed. I was looking out of the chock when it seemed that we were moving. A range was taken on the shore. Yes, the bow moved. Sunk deep, the tide was driving it on and straightening us out. My heart sank. Oh, for the warheads! Why did not the admiral let us have them? The tide wrenched us off Estrella, straightened us out, and set us right down the channel toward the part where its width increases. Though sinking fast, there still remained considerable freeboard, which would admit of our going some distance, and we were utterly helpless to hasten the sinking. A great wave of disappointment set over me. It was anguish as intense as the exultation a few minutes before. On the tide set us, as straight as a pilot and tugboats could have guided. Socapa Station fired 2 mines, but alas, they missed us, and we approached the bight leading to Churruca Point on the right, and the bight cutting off Smith Key from Socapa on the left, causing the enlargement of the channel. I saw with dismay that it was no longer possible to block completely. The Merrimac gave a premonitory lurch, then staggered to port in a death throe. The bow almost fell, it sank so rapidly. We crossed the keel line of a vessel removed a few hundred feet away behind Socapa. It was the Reina Mercedes. Her bow torpedoes bore on us. To the right, the Pluton was coming up from the bight, her torpedoes bearing. But alas, cruiser and destroyer were berthed too late to help us. They were only in at the death. Footnote: it was found that the Reina Mercedes fired both bow torpedoes, and Admiral Cervera informed me afterward that the Pluton had fired her torpedoes. The day following our entrance, 2 automobile torpedoes were found outside, having drifted with the current, and what was remarkable, one still had on the dummy or drill head. It cannot be said positively whether any of the automobiles took effect. If they did, we did not feel the effects where we were. In any case, they could not have appreciably affected the sinking. End of footnote. The stricken vessel now reeled to port. Someone said, "She's going to turn over on us, sir," to which I replied, "No, she will right herself in sinking, and we shall be the last spot to go under." The firing suddenly ceased. The vessel lowered her head like a faithful animal, proudly aware of its sacrifice, bowed below the surface, and plunged forward. The stern rose and heeled heavily. It stood for a moment, shuddering, and then started downward, righting as it went. A great rush of water came up the gangway, seething and gurgling out of the deck. The mass was whirling from right to left, against the sun. It seized us and threw us against the bulwarks, then over the rail. 2 were swept forward as if by a momentary recession, and 1 was carried down into a coal bunker, luckless Kelly. In a moment, however, with increased force, the water shot him up out of the same hole and swept him among us. The bulwarks disappeared. A sweeping vortex whirled above. We charged about with casks, cans, and spars, the incomplete stripping having left quantities on the deck. The life preserver stood us in good stead, preventing chests from being crushed as well as buoying us on the surface, for spars came end on like battering rams, and the sharp corners of tin cans struck us heavily. The experience of being swept over the side was rather odd. The water lifted and threw me against the bulwarks, the rail striking my waist. The upper part of the body was bent out, the lower part and the legs being driven heavily against what seemed to be the plating underneath which, singularly enough, appeared to open. A football instinct came promptly, and I drew up my knees, but it seemed too late, and apparently they were being driven through the steel plate, a phenomenon that struck me as being most singular. Yet there it was, and I wondered what the sensation would be like in having the legs carried out on one side of the rail and the body on the other, concluding that some embarrassment must be expected in swimming without legs. The situation was apparently relieved by the rail going down. Afterward Charette asked, "Did those oil cans that were left just forward of us trouble you also as we were swept out?" Perhaps cans, and not steel plates separated before my kneecaps. When we looked for the lifeboat, we found that it had been carried away. The catamaran was the largest piece of floating debris. We assembled about it. The line suspending it from the cargo boom held and anchored us to the ship, though barely long enough to reach the surface, caused the raft to turn over and set us scrambling as the line came taut. The firing had ceased. It was evident the enemy had not seen us in the general mass of moving objects, but soon the tide began to drift these away, and we were being left alone with the catamaran. The men were directed to cling close in, bodies below and only heads out, close under the edges, and were directed not to speak above a whisper, for the destroyer was near at hand and boats were passing near. We mustered, all were present, and direction was given to remain as we were till further orders, for I was sure that in due time after daylight a responsible officer would come out to reconnoiter. It was evident that we could not swim against the tide to reach the entrance. Moreover, the shores were lined with troops, and the small boats were looking for victims that might escape from the vessel. The only chance lay in remaining undiscovered until the coming of the reconnoitering boat, to which perhaps we might surrender without being fired on. The moon was now low. The shadow of Socapa fell over us, and soon it was dark. The sunken vessel was bubbling up its last lingering breath. The boat's crews, looking for refugees, pulled closer, peering with lanterns, and again the discipline of the men was put to severe test, for time and again it seemed that the boats would come up, and the impulse to swim away was strong. A suggestion was made to cut the line and let the catamaran drift away. This was also emphatically forbidden, for we should thus miss the reconnoitering boat and certainly fall into less responsible hands. Here, as before, the men strictly obeyed orders, though the impulse for safety was strong to the contrary, and sauve qui peut would have been justifiable, if it is ever justifiable. The air was chilly and the water positively cold. In less than 5 minutes our teeth were chattering, so loud indeed did they chatter that it seemed the destroyer or the boats would hear. It was in marked contrast with the parched lips of a few minutes before. In spite of their efforts, 2 of the men soon began to cough, and it seemed that we should surely be discovered. I worked my legs and body under the raft for exercise, but in spite of all, the shivers would come and the teeth would chatter. We remained there probably an hour. Frogs croaked up the bight, and as dawn broke, the birds began to twitter and chirp in the bushes and trees near at hand along the wooded slopes. Day came bright and beautiful. It seemed that nature disregarded man and went on the same, serene, peaceful, and unmoved. Man's strife appeared a discord, and his tragedy received no sympathy. About daybreak, a beautiful strain went up from a bugle at Punta Gorda Battery. It was pitched at a high key and rose and lingered, long drawn out, gentle and tremulous. It seemed as though an angel might be playing while looking down in tender pity. Could this be a Spanish bugle? Broad daylight came. The sun spotted the mountain tops in the distance and glowed on Morro and Socapa heights. The destroyer got up anchor and drew back again up the bight. We were still undiscovered. Someone now announced, "A steam launch is headed for us, sir." I looked around and found that a launch of large size, with the curtains aft drawn down, was coming from the bight around Smith Key and heading straight for us. That must be the reconnoitering party. It swerved a little to the left as if to pass around us, giving no signs of having seen us. No one was visible on board, everybody apparently being kept below the rail. When it was about 30 yards off, I hailed. The launch stopped as if frightened and backed furiously. A squad of riflemen filed out and formed in a semicircle on the forecastle and came to a load, ready, aim. A murmur passed about among my own men. They are going to shoot us. A bitter thought flashed through my mind. The miserable cowards. A brave nation will learn of this and call for an account. But the volley did not follow. The aim must have been for caution only, and it was apparent that there must be an officer on board in control. I called out in a strong voice to know if there was not an officer in the boat. If so, an American officer wished to speak with him with a view to surrendering himself and seamen as prisoners of war. The curtain was raised. An officer leaned out and waved his hand, and the rifles came down. I struck out for the launch and climbed on board aft with the assistance of the officer, who hours afterwards we learned was Admiral Cervera himself. With him were two other officers, his juniors. To him I surrendered myself and the men, taking off my revolver belt, glasses, canteen, and life preserver. The officers looked astonished at first, perhaps at the singular uniforms and the begrimed condition of us all, due to the fine coal and oil that came to the surface. Then a current of kindness seemed to pass over them, and they exclaimed, "Valiente!" Then the launch steamed up to the catamaran, and the men climbed on board, the two who had been coughing being in the last stages of exhaustion and requiring to be lifted. We were prisoners in Spanish hands. End of Part 2, Section 2. Part 3, Section 1 of The Sinking of the Merrimac by Richmond Pearson Hobson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 3, Imprisonment in Morro Castle. Section 1, containing generous reception on the Mercedes, a surprise for the Spanish officers, how the news of the crew's safety came to be sent to Admiral Sampson, reflections on the result of the maneuver, removal to the Morro, courtesies from Admiral Cervera, in the cell of the Morro, Captain Bustamante's kindness. When we were all on board and had laid aside our arms and accouterments, the launch headed about and stood for the Reina Mercedes, and I directed the men who were shivering to get down near the furnace, to which no objection was raised. Not a word was spoken until we reached the Mercedes. However great may have been their curiosity and interest, the officers, after their first kind words of greeting, forbore to ask questions or make remarks. When we came alongside, the senior officer asked if I would be good enough to go on board with my men. So courteous was his manner, we might have been guests coming to breakfast. The officer of the deck and the executive officer met us at the head of the gangway. I bowed salute and inspected the men for their condition. Those who were still shivering were sent forward at once for stimulants and friction. Kelly's lip showed a wide gash that had become clogged with coal dust. Murphy had a wound in his right hip, 12 or 14 inches in length, and perhaps a quarter or a half of an inch in depth, which he had received in the blast when he fired torpedo number 1. And though the wound certainly must have been painful, he had not uttered a groan or made any reference to it during all the time that had elapsed. It was only after our arrival on the Mercedes that we learned of it. The men were all more or less scratched and bruised from colliding with objects in the vortex whirl, but there was no injury of consequence, the life preservers having formed excellent buffers. The executive officer followed the inspection and gave directions for the care of the men. Kelly and Murphy went to the surgeon, and all were given facilities for washing and were supplied with dry clothing. We found the crew of the Mercedes scrubbing down decks and clearing up after the engagement. Everybody seemed to be on deck, and the men, singly and in groups, stared at us with wild-eyed astonishment. Our unconventional uniforms had suffered in adjustment, and they must have thought us an odd-looking group of man-of-war's men. The men having gone forward, the executive officer invited me to his stateroom, had a bath prepared for me and clothing of his own set out, and invited me to come into the wardroom, when ready, and join him at breakfast. The oil and fine coal that had come to the surface had had full chance to permeate, and made heavy bath work, with the executive officer's civilian clothing, made for a different build, was of questionable fit, but the difficulties due to excessive girth secured the return of my sword belt when it had been dried out. Special full dress, however, could not have brought out a whit more courteous and cordial treatment. After a hearty handshake of congratulations and repeated kind words, the executive officer, with thoughtful reference to our exposure, ordered stimulants. I told him, however, that I was in good shape, none the worse off, and that the breakfast coffee, I was sure, would be sufficient. He gave me his card: Emilio J. de Acosta y Ayerman, Capitan de Fragata, adding in pencil, Segundo Comandante de Cruce Reina Mercedes, and I told him my name and rank. While eating, we fell into frank and general conversation, all the officers except one having finished breakfast. Captain Acosta gallantly opened the conversation by saying that there was no reason why officers engaged in honorable warfare, though opposing to their utmost in battle, might not be the best of friends. He went on to describe how he himself had directed the fire of 2 heavy guns against the entering vessel, though a large part of his crew were absent manning guns that had been put ashore, and how he had finally sunk her by 2 Whitehead torpedoes from his bow tubes, remarking that the mines fired at us seemed to have missed going astern. He added that, of course, it was an unequal fight, that in fact it seemed to him that we should have known from the natural formation of the entrance that it would be impossible for a vessel to force her way through. He then asked what battery we had. I had just referred to being on duty on the New York, and understood him to refer to her, and in reply enumerated her battery, mentioning that he would find it in any of the naval annuals. This seemed to agree with what he had concluded was the battery, and he then asked how many men we had lost. I told him we had lost none. He asked where, then, were all the crew, and all those that were below in the engine and boiler rooms and magazines. I saw that he had been referring all the time to the vessel that came in, and told him that she was the Merrimac, a collier, and had no guns at all, that we had sunk her ourselves, and would have sunk her athwart near Estrella if the steering gear had not been shot away and nearly all our own torpedoes disabled, adding that though one of their mines had struck us, it was doubtful if it had assisted our sinking to any extent, and that we had felt no shock from the automobile torpedoes fired by the Mercedes. He seemed utterly incredulous. The same experience was met with in the case of the other Spanish officers. The explosions of their own projectiles must have been taken for the firing of guns on board the Merrimac. Some went so far as to locate 2 heavy turrets with 2 guns each, one forward and one aft, and a battery of rapid-fire guns amidships. Apparently, the facts were accepted only after information from the outside, derived either from the New York by the boat which subsequently took out a flag of truce, or from the United States via Madrid. When we had finished breakfast, the commanding officer, who had come to the gangway when we first came on board, came into the wardroom. I was introduced, and he gave me his card: Rafael Micon, Capitan de Navio, below which he had written, Admira al valiente Capitan y la dona gran suerte. I told him my name and rank, and he expressed surprise, as had Captain Acosta, that a constructor should be engaged in military duty at the seat of war. It was difficult to explain to him that our constructors are recruited differently from those abroad, having the same military training as line officers. We fell into general conversation, in which he philosophized on the question of the war, pointing out that the Cubans were ungrateful, and in general a bad lot, that Cuba itself was really an encumbrance upon Spain, that it was recognized, in fact, that Cuba was lost, and Spain fought only for tradition and honor. This seems to have been the general view of the officers with whom I conversed afterward. These observations were made in a delicate way, without involving the attitude of the United States, but I made no reply to them. When Captain Micon left, I asked for writing materials, for I had concluded to try to communicate with Admiral Sampson, with a view of getting information sent out that would allay the anxiety of our families, since it was evident that from their observation of the magnitude of the fire directed upon the Merrimac, our friends on the fleet would give us all up for lost. The information was directed to Admiral Sampson, and the Spanish commander-in-chief was requested to send it out under flag of truce. The 2 communications read as follows: To Admiral Sampson, Spanish ship Reina Mercedes, Santiago de Cuba, June 3, 1898. Sir, I have the honor to report that the Merrimac is sunk in the channel. No loss, only bruises. We are prisoners of war, being well cared for. Very respectfully, R. P. Hobson, Assistant Naval Constructor, U.S.N. Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Naval Forces, off Santiago de Cuba. To Admiral Cervera. Spanish ship Reina Mercedes, Santiago de Cuba, June 3, 1898. Sir, I have the honor to request that the enclosed communication be sent under flag of truce to the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Forces off Santiago de Cuba. Very respectfully, Richmond Pearson Hobson, Assistant Naval Constructor, United States Navy. To Commander-in-Chief, Spanish Forces, Santiago de Cuba. The report to Admiral Sampson was first drafted to read, I have the honor to report that the Merrimac is sunk in the channel, not where planned, but the best that could be done, no loss, etc. But I thought that the additional clause would be more likely to prevent the delivery of the communication. The request, in fact, was a singular one to make, even of a generous enemy. But our reception and treatment had been exceedingly kind, and it was evident that unless informed at once, the squadron would report us lost. When the letters were turned in, Captain Acosta placed his stateroom at my service, showed me photographs of his family, and told me to make myself at home, insisting that I must be tired and should lie down in his bunk while he went out to attend to duties. Evidently, we were to be treated kindly as prisoners of war, and would have some chance of being exchanged, if no chance of escape should occur beforehand, and should then have further opportunity for action. Left alone, my first thought was naturally of home. Then my mind began to go over the situation, the condition of the defenses, and the effect of the sinking of the Merrimac. Probably the Spanish fleet could get by her, one at a time, but it would be a delicate and difficult operation for a large ship, especially at night. They could not stop or anchor or make any formation at the enlargement of the channel or utilize the two bights extending to the right and left. They were talking about this very subject in the wardroom. An officer had evidently come on board, and the conversation had become animated, so that the words and even whole sentences could be heard. But he says positively that the channel is blocked, and as far as I could gather, the statement appeared to be quoted from an army engineer sent to investigate. My heart leaped. Could it be, after all, that the channel was completely blocked? But sober thought again reasoned. No, they may think so for a while, may continue to be in doubt. The difficulties and disadvantages imposed may cause hesitation and delay, and may permit of further preparation on our part, but when it becomes necessary, pilots can surely take their fleet out by daylight, one at a time. Again and again I reviewed the situation, but each time the inevitable conclusion came back that the blocking was incomplete. Hard and bitter was the thought, beyond the comfort of philosophy in its assurance that the human factor of the problem was complete, and that the element of incompleteness was beyond human control. These thoughts had continued perhaps an hour, when Captain Acosta came in to say that an officer from General Linares had come down from the Morro, and that the prisoners were ordered to be taken to the castle. The captain said that he was very much distressed, that they had hoped to entertain us on the Mercedes, and he feared we might not fare so well. We went into the cabin, and I was introduced to the officer. A formal conversation was kept up for a short while, when another officer was announced, and I was introduced to Captain Bustamante, Chief of Staff of Admiral Cervera. I said that I had had the pleasure of meeting Captain Bustamante in the launch this morning, to which the captain made a pleasant reply, and then stated that it was his duty to inform me that Lieutenant General Linares, commanding the department, had taken the prisoners from the hands of the Navy and had ordered them to be transferred to the Morro, and that the launch was waiting to take us. We found my men already at the gangway. In going out, it was discovered that no hat had been provided for me, and the nearest officer, the navigator, charged back to get one, which was a straw hat of the American type. I had the pleasure of entertaining this officer afterward on the New York 2 days after the surrender. My men all had on dry clothing, Spanish sailor uniforms. Their wounds had been dressed, and a good breakfast had been served to them. There was something touching in the good-byes at the gangway, the Spanish officers expressing repeated regrets that we should be taken away to the Morro. When I was thanking them for the kind treatment received on board, Charette stepped out and requested me, for the men, to express their thanks and appreciation. The Spanish officers and sailors seemed surprised to see such thoughtful courtesy in the seamen. In fact, the admirable conduct and bearing of the men throughout the term of imprisonment was a continued source of surprise to the Spaniards, officers speaking to me from time to time about these remarkable men. I assured them that the men were simply types of the American seaman. Captain Acosta shook hands and said he would come up to see me in the Morro and bring some reading matter, and begged that I would call upon him in case he could be of service. These kind purposes were not destined to be fulfilled, for, alas, I was not to see the gallant captain again. A guard followed us into the launch, and we stood across the entrance, passing only a short distance from the Merrimac. Looking at her, the conclusion was inevitable that the channel was not completely blocked, and I felt again the sting of bitter disappointment. We rounded Estrella Point, stood into the cove, and landing at the small wharf, climbed the steep height approaching Morro from the rear. We climbed slowly, Captain Bustamante stopping to catch breath, and gained a height from which stretched out the entrance and Socapa, Estrella, Charruca, Punta Gorda, Smith Key, and the opening of the bay beyond, where lay the vessels that meant so much. We pushed on, and there close at hand had a full view of Morro from the north, the walls all black from the weather of ages, a very type of medieval castle that had so interested me when I was in Europe, telling so much dark history and hiding so much more. Why were we going in there? Were we not to be treated as prisoners of war? On top, a short distance off the path, stood an officer in frock coat and white trousers, looking at us as we came up. The captain confirmed my impression that it was Admiral Cervera, and verified my identification of him as the officer who had assisted me into the launch in the morning, and the young officer who had been with him in the launch proved to be his son. The admiral must have dressed hurriedly in the morning, for in the launch I had not noticed any insignia of his rank. As we passed, I saluted with the captain, and the admiral returned the salute. We crossed the bridge over the moat, passed the portcullis, and entered a vaulted passage where an officer and guard were waiting. Captain Bustamante spoke to the officer, apparently the adjutant, a thick-set man, low, heavy, with a long black beard and raven eyes, apparently the man for the place. The men were conducted on through, and the jailer, with a ring of massive keys, led me to the left under an arched entrance into the guard-room. There were 2 chairs and a table. The jailer made a motion to a chair and sat down. He was a remarkable man, probably 6'2", all bone and muscle, aquiline features, a face with a hard set expression that seemed never to have been disturbed by the passing of an emotion, the man to carry out orders to the letter, whatever their nature. We sat on in silence for a few minutes, when Admiral Cervera entered, and we rose, and the jailer withdrew without a word. The admiral advanced with outstretched hand and with an inquiry as to my welfare, the greeting of a charming gentleman and gallant officer. I felt at home with him at once. We sat down, and he went on to say that he had received my note enclosing the report to the commander-in-chief of the American forces, and that he had been particularly desirous to deliver it. But, being a communication with the enemy, it was necessary to refer the matter to General Linares, who, as a lieutenant general, was his senior, and that General Linares had refused to let the report be delivered. However, a flag of truce would be taken out, and the American admiral would be informed of our escape and safety. The conversation, carried on in French, then became more or less general, only a reference being made to the Merrimac, the admiral inquiring as to her size, but carefully avoiding embarrassing questions. He spoke of American officers whom he had met, and inquired particularly about Admiral Luce, whom he had seen in Spain in connection with the Columbian celebration. I referred to the report that he had had service in the United States, mentioning that I had understood he had been on duty in Washington as naval attaché to the Spanish legation. He replied that this was a mistake, that the attaché belonged to another family. During my 2 years' cruise as midshipman, I had visited a number of ports in Spain, and later, while on duty in Paris, on a mission to the French shipyards, I had taken occasion, en route from Bordeaux to Toulon, to cross the Pyrenees into Spain. He knew all the places I had visited, and conversation continued in the pleasantest vein for probably 10 minutes. The admiral left with the salutations and the courteous manner that would have marked a visit to a friendly admiral on his flagship. Ah, I thought, this admiral commanding the Spanish naval forces has taken the pains to put on the uniform for official visits, and has come at the very earliest moment to visit a young lieutenant of the enemy in prison. Surely chivalry is not yet dead. As the admiral left, the jailer re-entered, and led the way out of the room through the passageway to the rear, down a flight of steps, across a sort of court, then up another flight of stairs, stopping before the door of the highest cell, which occupied the top of the southwest angle of the castle, a sentry having followed us. The door faces to the southward and eastward, from a commanding position, and while the jailer was adjusting the heavy key and throwing back the bolts, I gazed out over the sea. There lay our vessels. I recognized them all, slowly moving back and forth in 2 columns. What a sight! The power of a great nation concentrating with determined purpose, history calling, the eternal rule of justice appealing, the God of war impelling. A heavy blow was about to fall for liberty and the sacred cause of human right. It was a great sociological phenomenon, and the individual was not to be counted, was indeed happy in being lost. The jailer threw open the door, and as we entered the barren and filthy cell, flies and insects started up. Then I perceived the word muerte written on the wall. The last prisoner must have died there, and evidently the cell had not been cleaned since. The jailer withdrew, leaving the sentry at the door. An attendant brought in a box with 4 upright strips nailed at the corners for a table, but it would not stand, so he leaned it against the wall and left. The sentry closed the door, locking it and bolting it. This then was my cell, and that was its furniture. I walked up and down on the broken brick and mortar floor and wondered where my men could be. After a while, the door opened and Captain Bustamante entered. He must have been shocked at the situation, for his first word was an apology. He said that he was distressed, and such condition of things would not be allowed to continue, and that I must regard it as only temporary. I assured him that I should ask for no indulgence, but that he must perceive that the sanitary condition was utterly intolerable, that I must ask that the cell be cleaned and the door left open for light and ventilation, that my men be given clean cells, and that we be allowed means of keeping our cells and persons clean, as otherwise infection would be inevitable, with every probability of blood poisoning through the wounds and scratches. He replied that he personally would look to the matter at once. He had come, he continued, to ask if there was anything he might do for me in connection with the flag of truce which he was about to take out to the fleet. I asked if it would not be inconsistent with his duty, that simply as a matter of personal satisfaction to me, he would mention to Admiral Sampson that the Merrimac's steering gear had been shot away. He replied that he feared he should not be allowed to speak about the subject at all. I asked him then if he would be kind enough to make inquiry about a young colleague of mine who had come away after the Merrimac in a steam launch. I had been very anxious about Powell. I knew, of course, that he would not think of coming within the fire of the guns on the slope of Skokapa, but as the picket boat was not far from the position where he was to lie, I feared lest the launch, which carried only rifles, might have fallen in with her. He said he could readily assure me on the subject, as no word had come in that the launch had been injured. I asked Captain Bustamante if he would be kind enough to have the surgeon directed to give careful and constant attention to the wounded men, and to allow one of the crew, Charette or Montague, to come in to receive instructions as to details in taking care of their health in confinement. End of Part 3, Section 1. Part 3, Section 2 of The Sinking of the Merrimac by Richmond Pearson Hobson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 3, Imprisonment in Morro Castle. Section 2, containing Every Man Would Do It Again Tonight, Sir. Comforts from the British Consul. Astonishing Report of Casualties in the Merrimac Affair. Why the Maneuver Failed. A Fancy of What Might Have Happened. Our Rations. Spanish and American Soldiers Compared. More Courtesies. A Reconnaissance from the Cell Window. A Midnight Intruder. A Question of Humanity. Soon after the captain left, directions for the door to be left open during the daytime were issued by the authorities, and in a few minutes Charette was sent in. He had his usual cheerful look, unperturbed by the sight of the men's wretched cell and by the uncertainties of our confinement. He referred to the heavy situation we had just passed through, and said, "Every man would do it again tonight, sir." Indeed, throughout the whole term of imprisonment the men showed the most remarkable spirit of cheerfulness. They never had the support of kind words and courteous visits, as I did, yet never once did they exhibit signs of anxiety or fear. The Spanish soldiers at first taunted them as they would Cuban prisoners, called them desperados, accused them of fighting for money, and made signs of dealing out coin, and passed their fingers across their throats and shook their heads to indicate the fate that awaited the crew. My men only smiled at such taunts, and they actually laughed at the gruesome mockings. It seems that the impression was more or less general at first, that the men were not Americans, but a hired gang of desperadoes. Several days later, one of the officers spoke in a similar strain, whereupon I asked him what he meant. He replied, "For instance, 2 of your men are deserters from the Spanish army, and that man Charette is a Catalonian from the northeastern part of Spain. 1 of your men is a Swede, and others a German." I told him he was never more mistaken in his life, that the men were all American citizens, regularly enlisted and serving in the American Navy, and that so far from its being necessary to get desperate men for the work, virtually the whole fleet had volunteered for it, and had pleaded to be allowed to go. This it seemed impossible for him to understand. Charette had not been gone long when, to my surprise, men began bringing in furniture: a table, a washstand, a pitcher, a basin, a cot with a good double blanket, and several chairs, one of them a rocker, while at the same time a hammock and a blanket were taken to each man. This proved to be the first of a long series of thoughtful kindnesses from Frederick W. Ramsden, Esquire, British Consul at Santiago. Kindnesses that contributed in the most essential manner to the health and comfort of the American prisoners. His thoughtfulness had been so prompt that these articles had come down all the way from Santiago City before we had been an hour in the Morro. After the arrival of the furniture, the situation, with my door open, looking out over the sea, was actually cheerful. It was not long before the governor of the Morro came, making me a most cordial visit. He was followed by the colonel commanding the artillery. This officer, after kind salutations, referred to the heavy fire he had withstood so long, and to the gallantry of our fire in return. When I informed him that we had no guns on board, he was utterly incredulous, and seemed to conclude that I was deceiving him, for he replied, "But I know you must have fired, for I myself was struck on the foot, though I was standing away up above." I replied that it must have been a fragment resulting from their own fire, at which the colonel became serious, as though a new and unwelcome thought was passing through his mind. He, too, had taken us for an armored vessel forcing our way through, and what he said about our fire puzzled me. The next time Charette came in, he told me that wounded men were being operated on in the room just above the men's cell, and that the blood was running down the wall and had run down the clews of his hammock, so that he had had to change its position. When I had a chance to speak to him and to the others afterward, they said that both a Spanish sergeant and a Spanish private had told them that the blood came from the men we had wounded, that we had killed 14 and wounded 37. In a visit to the Morro after the surrender, I was very much puzzled to find fresh gashes and imprints of various sizes in the rear walls, as though it had been attacked from the inshore side, while we had attacked only from the sea. Every indication seems to point to the conclusion that the Spaniards firing at the Merrimac had struck their own men across the channel. This was the more to be expected from the horizontal fire. Morro, though elevated, was in the line of fire from the Reina Mercedes, whose projectiles exploding on the Merrimac doubtless showered the banks and the rear of Morro beyond. No wonder, then, that they took us for an armored man-of-war. My mind turned again to the Merrimac, and I realized with repeated pangs that she did not completely block the channel. The ground tackle had exhibited extraordinary qualities of resistance, and with the slightest help of the helm to start the turning, it was evident that the vessel would have swung to her position athwart with mathematical precision. But at the last moment the steering gear was destined to be shot away. The entire speed of the vessel had been absorbed by the elastic qualities of the anchor gear. Even then, if the stern anchor had been retarded only a few seconds longer, its chain would have held the vessel secure. Alas, it had been dropped a moment too soon, and, as was learned later, not by the man stationed there, but by the explosion of one of the enemy's projectiles. Again, only 2 torpedoes out of the whole number had gone off, and these were the least effective of all. In fact, that part of the ship affected by torpedo number 5 had already been flooded by the sea connections. This disabling of torpedoes had been due to the necessity of using batteries for their discharge instead of an electric machine. It was extraordinary that the mine had helped us, but little, if at all. It seemed by a hard fate to have flooded the region that had already been twice flooded by sea connections and by torpedo number 5. Again, how extraordinary, after resting 8 or 10 minutes grounded on Estrella, to be wrenched off by the tide. One would indeed expect a vessel so grounded to resist strongly the efforts of her own engines and of tugs. Then, when I saw her begin to straighten out in the channel, if we had only had the warheads, we should have gone down like a shot. It seemed strange that the admiral had twice refused to let me take them, though he had allowed everything else I had asked for. Then again, if the vessel had hung on only a few minutes longer, till the accelerated sinking due to the submergence of the cargo ports had set in, we scarcely should have been wrenched off before going down. But no. It seemed that we had to be wrenched off just soon enough to allow the vessel to drift down and straighten completely out. As I reviewed the experience, a flood of bitterness swept over me. These remarkable adverse coincidences could never happen again. As I saw the tug with a flag of truce going out to the fleet, I thought if I could only be exchanged quickly, or escape, the admiral would let me take in the other collier with the same plans and arrangements and the same crew. Another time I would guarantee complete blocking. While I was thinking over the circumstances of our capture, it struck me as singular that Admiral Cervera should have had a squad of riflemen in the steam launch, since his reconnaissance involved only a poor old catamaran and the top of the funnel and masts of a sunken vessel. Then it occurred to me that his precaution was a wise one, for otherwise we might have done a neat stroke of work. My men included a machinist, a fireman, and 2 coxswains, and the others were all determined fellows. Our loaded revolvers with waterproof cartridges were hidden under our life preservers. How easy it would have been under ordinary conditions, after getting on board the launch and untying the strings of our life preservers, on a signal from me to throw them off, draw revolvers, and cover all the men on board, and quietly take possession. I could have covered the three officers sitting together aft. My men could have taken stations, and we should have had force enough to continue to cover the crew of the launch, or they could easily have been shoved over. We could then have proceeded out of the harbor to the New York in the Spanish admiral's launch, with himself and his staff as trophies of the adventure. The admiral's launch would not have been fired on by the guns at the entrance, and even if the destroyer close by had taken alarm, she could not have hoisted anchor until we should have been well away, and she could not have chased us outside without having been met by the fire of our fleet. This maneuver would doubtless have suggested itself at the time, if it had not been for the formidable squad of riflemen. A soldier coming in at this time with a pan of frijoles or beans, my thoughts came back to my surroundings. The frijoles were followed by a pan of rice and bread. I had the table placed in front of the door so that I might watch the ships while I was eating. Appetite was keen, and my first meal in prison was very much relished. The regular ration consisted of frijoles, rice, and bread, and, except the bread, continued to be served in full quantity till the end of our captivity. As a rule, a piece of sausage came with the frijoles. The cooking did not vary, both staples being invariably boiled without seasoning, and exactly the same food was served at every meal, until the system somewhat rebelled and after a while called strongly for variety. Yet, on the whole, the food was nourishing. After the transfer to Santiago, a ration of beef was added, and it was clear that the authorities were giving me the same food that they issued to the Spanish officers. My men received the same ration of frijoles, rice, and bread, with a reduced ration of beef, while no beef at all was included in the ration of the Spanish soldier. Flour soon became scarce, and corn and a mixture of corn and rice was substituted. It was evident, however, that the Spaniards depended on bread more than we did, and felt more keenly its scarcity. So it can be said broadly that during the imprisonment the prisoners fared as well as their captors, if not better. While I ate, the soldiers of the garrison lined up on the opposite side of the small court to receive their food, each one carrying his pan. One can imagine the interest with which I examined the Spanish soldiers, making mental comparisons with our own, and endeavoring to foresee the probable action and results when the two should be found facing each other, as I knew they would before many weeks. It was clear at a glance that they were from the peasant classes. Many of them were very young, and they averaged perhaps 4 or 5 inches less in height, and at least 25 pounds less in weight than our men. They did not look to be in good health, having bad complexions, and many of them were coughing. It was clear that we heavily outclassed them physically. The most striking feature, however, was the completely passive expression of the face. They made little effort at conversation and seldom smiled. For some time they had probably been working very hard on the emplacements for batteries, and there seemed no surplus energy for any other activity. The eye was usually dull, having a steady, stoical look, in some cases pathetic. In temperament they were clearly just the opposite of our own troops, who, recruited from a higher class, had the alert, animated look of aggressive men. As luncheon was completed, an orderly appeared with a tray bearing cigars, cigarettes, and a bottle of cognac, which he presented with the compliments of the governor of the Morro, delivering at the same time a note in French, with cautiously couched words of kindness, to this effect: Sir, the commandant of the fortress and the officers of the engineers and of the artillery have the honor to salute you, and to offer to do anything in their power to ameliorate your situation. We therefore beg you to make known to us your wishes. Accept, sir, the compliments of our highest esteem. Antonio Ros, the governor. There could not have been a more thoughtful token of kindness, hospitality, and good wishes, though, as it happened, I was not accustomed to using any of the articles offered. Having nothing to write with, I had to send my compliments and thanks by verbal message. When the orderly was gone, I sent the soldiers who were waiting on me to the crew with the cigars and cigarettes, keeping a few, however, together with the cognac; and these, singular as it appears, were used to offer the hospitality of the cell to the officers that called later. I was deeply touched by the calls which I continued to receive from officers during the afternoon and the following days. My visitors were of all grades, and many came from a distance. Officers, nearly all my seniors in age and rank, would beg, as they put it in warm and dignified words, to be allowed to shake my hand. There can be no question that the Spanish character is deeply sensible to a genuine sentiment. The history of warfare probably contains no instance of chivalry on the part of captors greater than that of those who fired on the Merrimac, and I know that harshness of treatment could have had its origin only in official considerations. The afternoon passed quickly. In the intervals between visits I would walk up and down, or sit in the doorway and look out over the sea at our fleet, which with its stately movements presented constantly changing positions in constantly changing effects of light. I also noticed the vultures that sailed about close at hand, turning their uncanny heads as if investigating, and the graceful bosun birds with a long marlin-spike body and keenly tapered bow wings. At 5, dinner or supper was served with the same food, the soldiers lining up as for luncheon. The sun sank. The vessels stood to their night positions. The sentry closed the door, shoved the bolt, and turned the key. A shaft of light still came in through the small barred window high up in the wall on the west side, the only opening beside the door. I walked up and down in the darkness till the lampman came in with a lamp. I turned it low, screening it, and continued walking till about 9, when I moved the cot beneath the window as if preparing to sleep, and lay down. When I was sure the sentry would believe me asleep, I stepped on the cot and drew myself up to investigate the window. What a sight greeted me! The view was down a sheer height of perhaps 250 feet upon the entrance, and stretching out to the westward and northwestward under the full moon lay a tragic panorama, weird in its stillness, with the mountains in the distance, and Socapa just across, showing the glint of guns in its batteries on top and on the slopes. There lay the picket boat again, just outside the entrance. Farther in, the bow of the Reina Mercedes stood out clear behind Socapa, and beyond her, in the bight to the left near Smith Key, lay a destroyer, seemingly looking at the sunken Merrimac just ahead. So, then, they had a destroyer on each side of the channel, up the bight to the left as well as to the right. Beyond Smith Key lay the black and sullen hull of the Vizcaya, with her broadside to the opening channel. The masts of her two sister ships, the Maria Teresa and the Almirante Oquendo, and those of the Colon beyond Punta Gorda, showed that they too would bear upon a vessel passing into the inner harbor. Excepting the battery to the eastward of Morro, the panorama included all the defenses of the channel. How remarkable this entrance lends itself to defense, and how cleverly the Spaniards had availed themselves of its natural advantages. Since luncheon I had been thinking about the defenses and their bearing upon the prosecution of the war. I had heard Admiral Sampson and Captain Chadwick refer to the selection of a point for landing troops, and wondered if it were intended to try to take the city and attack the enemy's ships from the land. And the more I thought on the subject, the more futile such an attempt seemed. How could the city be occupied under the guns of the enemy's ships? How could land artillery of sufficient caliber to outclass the armor of the Spanish vessels ever be placed in position under the fire of their guns? How could such artillery even be landed and transported under existing conditions? The conclusion grew stronger that land operations against the ships and the army of occupation would probably cost thousands of lives, that the ships should be captured or destroyed, and the city taken by our vessels, the army's best function being simply to cut off escape inland and to occupy the place after surrender. Steadily, this conclusion engendered a profound conviction that if the enemy should not come out, we should go in. I determined to make every possible endeavor to get back to the fleet with my knowledge of the defenses. Escape from the cell was impossible. I should have to await further developments. My mind turned again upon the Merrimac. How fortunate it seemed to me now that she did not go down athwart the channel. Our entrance for the rest of the war would have been impossible. She could not be better situated. The enemy would hesitate a long time before trying to pass, thus allowing time for our whole fleet to arrive. Their ships could not form in the enlargement of the channel, or even across it, but would have to pass single file, and would be at great risk if they tried to pass at night. Heaven had not frowned upon our efforts after all. The series of coincidences that had kept us from going down athwart were only the steady guidance of a kindly fate. I went to sleep with a thankful mind. I slept soundly, having had no sleep for about 63 hours, and only about 6 hours during the previous 87. As deep as the sleep was, however, it was interrupted during the night, as I became aware of efforts being made to pry me off the cot, as it were, and I suddenly recognized that a huge insect was using its body for a wedge or crowbar. I recognized in the space a species of big spider that I had seen in the afternoon, something of a cross between a spider and a crab, with a round black body and a multitude of red legs. Naturally, I took measures to get rid of such a bedfellow, but I knew that the tribe was too hopelessly numerous for extermination. Old Morro seems to be their breeding ground. I have not found them elsewhere, and I believe they are not poisonous. I was still asleep when the soldier came in to bring breakfast, coffee, and bread. I asked him if there was anything else. He answered, "No, senor," in a half-injured tone of surprise, as if to say, "What do you expect? Who ever heard of anybody having anything else?" Early in the forenoon, Captain Bustamante came in. He said that he had taken out the flag of truce with information that we were well, and had brought back a box for me, and the men's bags, and $25 in gold, all from the New York, with a memorandum from Flag Lieutenant Staunton, with whom he had communicated. He then said there was a matter which he hoped I would pardon him for referring to. He trusted I would not consider him impertinent in asking about the torpedoes on the Merrimac, to which I had referred while on the Reina Mercedes, since it was a question of humanity. He wished to know about them for the guidance of divers whose destruction could not affect the issue of war. I had decided that it would be best to give out no further information about the Merrimac, in order to keep the Spaniards guessing, and to have them keep clear of the vessel and hesitate to take measures to blow her out of the channel. I therefore told the captain that it would distress me to think that harmless divers should suffer, and as a matter of humanity, I would tell him that there were torpedoes on the vessel. But as to their location or arrangement or any other features, he must excuse me from giving information. He was most courteous and apologized for having ventured the question, reiterating that he asked only for humanity's sake and because I had voluntarily made reference to the subject on the Mercedes. Referring to the matter of our having been put in the Morro by order of General Linares, he said he had seen the general, and during the conversation the general said he would not visit me, because he feared that if he came he should not be able to bring himself to do his official duty. I wondered what he meant by his official duty. I have never been able to clear this matter up with any satisfaction. Mr. Ramsden told me during his first visit, without any reference to the matter on my part, that the general had said the same thing to him. The general kept his word. Although he sent a courteous message of greeting by Mr. Ramsden at this visit, he never called, and only sent his chief of staff on the day before our exchange. I do not know whether he changed his interpretation of his official duty. End of Part 3, Section 2. Part 3, Section 3 of The Sinking of the Merrimac by Richmond Pearson Hobson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 3. Imprisonment in Morro Castle. Section 3. Containing supplies from the fleet. An official inquiry. Thoughts of escape. Under fire from the American fleet. Inventing a plan of attack. After the bombardment. Before the captain left, the box and bags came. The box was one of my galvanized iron Carling boxes. The bags were the regular bags of the men from the New York and the Iowa, with special bags made up from the stores of the New York for the others, all carefully prepared and marked. Charette and Montague were sent for, and came and examined the bags, and we made a list of the articles needed and not kept in the bags, such as pipes, toothbrushes, etc. The captain took the list, and the articles came by the next courier from Santiago, being paid for upon delivery. I asked the captain if it could not be arranged to allow my men to wash their clothes, and to allow one of them to come in to see me every day and make known their needs and give account of the wounded men. Both concessions were granted by the governor of the Morro. Charette and Montague were still with me when the captain left. The sight of the bags seemed to make them as happy as children, and while getting the bags together they talked about the marvelous escape in coming in, and spoke in a touching way of having been brought through. One can scarcely imagine the exquisite joy the box and bags brought us, coming direct from our friends and comrades, who, though within sight, seemed impassably separated. It was like receiving a cablegram from a dear one across the sea, some message which, in spite of the vast gulf of separation, still holds, as it were, the warmth and breadth of kindness and affection. When the men were gone, I opened my box and found its contents most carefully and thoughtfully prepared. The books, plans, and articles which I had left in it had been taken out, and in their stead were a service dress uniform, a white uniform, and extra trousers, and other apparel, with a shaving outfit and other toilet articles complete. It was touching to see that where my own things could not be found, my messmates had sent theirs. One of them, who sat near me at table, had recently passed a birthday, and his wife had sent him as a present a fine new outfit of carefully chosen underwear, the very thing for the climate. He had taken me into his stateroom and had shown the articles to me with pride and enthusiasm, and I saw how much he prized them as coming from her. There they were in my box. I shifted into uniform at once, blue blouse and white trousers, and this uniform I wore throughout. I returned the clothing of Captain Acosta with a message of compliments and thanks, the messenger bringing back from him a kindly note of acknowledgment, together with the garments I had left behind. The men's borrowed articles were similarly returned, and their discarded ones brought back, from which they vainly tried to wash out the coal dust and oil. The forenoon of Saturday, June 4th, passed without incident. The surgeon came after making his rounds and reported the men's wounds as healing rapidly. About 2 o'clock in the afternoon, while I was seated in the rocker just inside the door, gazing out over the fleet, an official with a stern look appeared, and as I made a movement to rise, with an expression of hauteur, waved his hand and said I need not rise. I rose, however, and offered him a chair, which he declined. He was followed by another august-looking official, whose mouth seemed hermetically sealed, and who carried paper, pen, and ink, and he in turn by a third, who addressed me in English. That official is the juez de instrucción, the judge of instruction. And he paused as if to see the effect of this announcement. This is the secretario, and I am the official interpreter. Well, I am sure I am happy to meet you, gentlemen. Will you not be kind enough to take seats? I replied, placing chairs to the front. The secretary took his chair, set it alongside the table, and arranged his paper and ink without a word. And the judge and the interpreter finally taking chairs, we all sat down, and I waited for them to take the initiative. The judge spoke to the interpreter, who, turning to me, said that the judge had come to examine me, and gave me fair warning to make my answers full and accurate. I said that I did not doubt that the proceeding was entirely regular, but that I should be indebted if, before the questions began, he would be kind enough to explain to me under whose orders they came, and what was the object and nature of the questions. He answered that they came under the orders of the commander of the port, and would question me as to the vessel that had come in on Friday morning. I asked who the commander of the port was, and from whom he received his authority. He replied that the commander of the port was the officer charged with all the affairs of the harbor, and that he received his authority from the captain general. The captain general receiving his authority from the government at Madrid. I asked them if Admiral Cervera, who had captured me, and the British consul who was charged with the business of my government, knew of the proceeding. The judge, who had shown signs of irritation, then burst out at me direct. He did not know whether Admiral Cervera and the British consul knew of the matter, and he did not care. He did not intend to have his authority questioned. He came to ask questions, not to be questioned. He had never seen such a prisoner, and he rose to his feet in wrath. I rose at the same time and faced him and told him he should have intelligence enough to know, and those who sent him should have intelligence enough to know, that the men who brought the Merrimac in could not be intimidated or coerced into answering unauthorized or impertinent questions. He said he would return and report that I refused to answer his questions. I replied that he did not seem to recognize that he had asked no questions. The defiance seemed to cool him off, and I suggested that he ask his questions, and I would tell him in each case whether I declined to answer or not, that I was sure it would only give me pleasure to answer those that were proper. He came over and sat near the secretary and began, the secretary copying the questions word for word, the interpreter translating word for word. What is your name? What is your rank and occupation? How old are you? Where were you born? Where have you lived? Are you single or married, etc.? I answered each question in turn, the interpreter translating my answers word for word, while the secretary wrote them down. When the identification questions were over, the next question was as follows. What was the object of the vessel coming into the harbor on Friday morning, the 3rd of June, and under whose authority were you acting? I answered that the vessel came in under the authority of the commander-in-chief of the United States forces off Santiago de Cuba, and then asked for paper and pencil, and drafted the following additional answer. Without in the slightest manner questioning the authority and the regularity of this interrogation, I must respectfully decline to answer in any way the first part of the question given until I have been informed by Admiral Cervera, by whose forces I was captured, and also by the English consul, who has been named to transact the business of the United States in the city of Santiago de Cuba, that they have been informed of this interrogation and of the nature of the question itself. And then I added the request that my men also be not subjected to question until after the receipt of such information. I superintended the translation into Spanish as the secretary took it down from the interpreter. While withholding the information, the answer would make it difficult for the judge to make out a case of defiance of any legitimate authority. The judge, in the meantime, had entirely changed his attitude. He ceased asking questions and began a pleasant conversation, saying that he lived under the same roof as the British consul, who was a capital fellow. He rose, and we walked up and down conversing. He said that he put aside his official capacity and asked if I had any objection to telling him personally if the vessel had come in without a pilot. I answered that it had. The difficulties of navigation seemed to strike him most. He had not seen the firing. "Will you not shake hands as man to man?" he asked, and I gave him a hearty clasp. "I, too, am a naval officer," he added, "and have been detailed to this duty." When the secretary was through writing, he also unbent, and the interpreter joined in, and on leaving, the three were full of kind words. Footnote: the judge proved to be Lieutenant Jose Mueller y Tejero, second in command of the Spanish naval forces of the province of Santiago. The secretary was Lieutenant Dario Laguna. End of footnote. The interrogation was never taken up again, though General Linares seemed to have been displeased with the result of it, For the next day he caused Admiral Cervera and the British consul each to write me an official letter informing me that he was in supreme command in Santiago, and that he had the complete direction of the matter of the prisoners. The judge did not go to the men's cell, but various persons asked them questions, Charette, who speaks French, being called up as spokesman. In one case, a major, with imperious air and stern voice of command, asked what was the object of our coming in. Charette drew himself up and said in a firm voice, "In the American Navy it is not the custom for a seaman to know or to ask to know the object of his superior officer." The major was so much impressed that he stopped asking questions and offered Charette a cigar. The day passed without further incident, except in visits of courtesy from officers, as on the previous day. Having occasion to cross the courtyard, I took new observation as to the chances of escape, but it was as hopeless as in the cell, for a sentry accompanied me, and the guards occupied the entrance, while on all the other sides the walls went down to great depths. When I would pass near my men's cell, they would look out at me through the barred door. As I went by, the soldiers sitting near would rise and salute with as much respect as for their own officers, if not more. They had probably been impressed by the visits paid to me. With the strict watch kept, it was evident that there could be but little, if any, hope of escape. Sunday, June 5th, passed like Saturday. Monday morning, June 6th, came in overcast. Early coffee had been served, and I was sitting back from the door when, with a whiz and a crash, came the sharp crack of an exploding shell, followed by the vibrating peal of an 8-inch gun from which it was fired. Another whiz and crash and crack and peal, another and another, and then came the king of projectiles, a 13-inch, the air screeching and crackling as if vitrified. I knew at once that a general bombardment had begun, and hastily examined the cell as to its protective features. The brick and mortar of the walls and the debris of the roof were more to be feared than the projectiles and their actual fragments. At the first shot, the sentry, as if he'd been previously instructed, quickly closed the door, bolted and locked it, and ran away. I concluded that the splinters from the door would be preferable to the brick and mortar from the wall. I pulled the table and the washstand in front of the door, end on, and stood the galvanized iron box up on its side against the front end of the table, a little back from the door, to catch any splinters from it. Then I crawled through the legs of the table and lay face down, with my head just behind the box in the direction of the firing. The table and washstand together were long enough to cover my head, body, and part of my legs from falling debris, and the box screened the door. The principal danger was from blows of brick and mortar that might be hurled obliquely by entering projectiles, and from the whole cell or wall beneath being blown out by a 13-inch projectile and falling and crumbling down the precipice. My men, I knew, were less exposed, being further back and down. The situation was simple, and nothing remained but to await developments. I knew what good marksmen our gunners were, and did not doubt that they would make quick work of the exposed parts of the Morro. The thought was scarcely formulated when a shock came that made the great mass tremble to its foundation. A heavy projectile had struck the wall facing the sea, and penetrating had exploded. While the pile was still vibrating, a sea swell swept into the caverns below and sent up a great, hollow, hungry roar. A flood of bitter thoughts passed over me. This, then, is the Spanish idea of honorable warfare, to place us here and make our own men the executioners. Then I began to study the phenomenon with intense interest, locating by sound the vessels and the targets at which they were firing. It soon became evident that the batteries to the eastward and westward of the entrance were the principal targets, and that they returned the fire, though there appeared to be another target farther to the eastward. From time to time the Morro itself would receive a shell, but it was not a principal target, and I concluded finally that the Morro, which did not answer the fire, would not be attacked till after the batteries were silenced, and therefore decided I would be justified in getting out from under the table to examine the phenomena from the window, to return as soon as the Morro should become a target. So I came out, placed the cot into position, drew myself up, and looked out. What sublimity of sight and sound! Our projectiles seemed like animated creatures in a wild chase, seething and screaming with rage, tearing to fragments everything they could touch in their mad flight, and keeping up a cloud of dust and gas about the battery. The 13-inch projectile seemed to have a dignity all its own, as though aware of its mighty power. Exploding, it would raise a great yellow cloud of earth and debris, sending forked shafts of gas out and up for 100 feet, while for many seconds afterward the fragments would continue to drop about the Morro and in the water of the entrance. The first panoramic glance showed that the enemy was not replying, while it showed that the Reina Mercedes was on fire. But I had scarcely begun the study of particulars when a projectile whizzed overhead, and another struck the Morro with full force. They have begun on the Morro, I thought, and jumped down and crawled under the table. The fire seemed to slacken for a moment. Then the enemy opened, and again the fire set in strong against the Socapa Sea battery, and I came out and climbed to the window once more, in time to see the crews of the enemy's guns leave them and run to a pit in the rear. Then I watched for the next lull. Sure enough, up they came again and fired away. Then our guns reopened in full force, and again the crews retreated to the pit. This occurred over and over, and then I realized, even more than in the bombardment of San Juan, that ships cannot destroy shore batteries without coming into machine gun range. It is necessary actually to strike the gun itself in order to put it out of action. I saw some of our shells literally bury guns with dirt, and yet do virtually no injury. Our marksmanship was excellent. Splendid line shots that tore up the shrubs and earth along the whole front of the battery. But I did not see a single gun disabled, and every time we would slacken, the Spaniards would come up and fire away. I understood how they could thus make the vaunted last shot. While absorbed in watching the Socapa southwest battery, a projectile struck the roof just over my head, exploded, and carried a pile of brick and mortar along, dropping it into the water. Once more I took to the table, only to come forth again after a few moments' reassurance, stopping this time to look through the small barred window of the door. The ships, however, were too close in to be seen, and there were only 2 men in the courtyard down by the door of the cell by my men. I climbed up again and became absorbed in the firing. I saw one projectile explode on the bow of the Reina Mercedes, which was already on fire. I wondered at the time if Captain Acosta were there, as he had told me it was his special station. Another struck far over across Smith Key, just in front of the Vizcaya. Another struck just in front of the Merrimac's foremast, close by a boat at the middle of the boom, made up of spars and chains, which the enemy had constructed from Smith Key to Churruca Point as an obstruction. Footnote: this boom was just above the sunken Merrimac, and was composed of 2 lines of spars and chains. The spars end on and break in joint. I had first noticed it on the morning of our adventure from the catamaran, soon after dawn. End of footnote. Several, one of them a 13-inch, hit Churruca Point, which was apparently mistaken by our gunner for Punta Gorda. Many continued to pass over my cell, and I wondered if our ships were trying high-angle fire over the Morro into the harbor beyond. Finally, one struck apparently in the cell next beyond mine on the same level, and for the 3rd time I took to my barricade. This was the last time, however, for I felt that it was important to make full observation of the enemy's defenses, as it would probably be the only chance by daylight, and that I would be justified in remaining at the window until it was clearly demonstrated that the fleet had turned full on the Morro. While looking this time, I saw men come out from beyond Socapa, near the Reina Mercedes, and run along the path near the water to the batteries on the slopes. These were so effectually concealed that only when the men came out was I able to locate the pieces. Probably these were reserved for vessels that might attempt to run in, and it was because they did not wish our vessels to find their locations that they did not fire out of the entrance, even those that could. There must have been a false alarm of a vessel starting in, for the men came running along the path. Then one of our vessels must have discovered them, for soon there was a burst of shrapnel sweeping the shoreline, and before many minutes the men ran back more rapidly than they came out. The bombardment continued thus for about 3 hours, and afforded me ample time to impress on my memory the exact location of all the guns and an exact picture of the surrounding topography. And instinctively I began to evolve plans for taking the western side of the entrance, landing in the direction of Cabanas, advancing and placing artillery on the ridge beyond Socapa, opening upon the sea battery from the flank and rear, and making a night assault on all the positions of Socapa, coming down from above on those of the slopes, extending the operation to boarding the Reina Mercedes from the starboard side, from which the guns had been removed, and destroying her if she could not be held under the fire of the enemy from Punta Gorda and the fleet. I believed that the battery to the eastward of the Morro could be similarly taken from the rear. The work would have to be done quickly to avoid the massing of Spanish troops to cut off the advance, and in the case of the Morro side, such reinforcements could be sent down rapidly from the city. On each side, the guns would probably have to be destroyed and then abandoned. The main operation, the entrance of the fleet, might begin at daybreak, and I set to work on the details of its entrance and of the tactics necessary to destroy the enemy's fleet most effectively. Finally, the firing ceased. I came down quietly, after closing my eyes several times to be sure that I could picture the scene with accuracy. I pulled the cot back, put the table and washstand and box in place, put on a clean pair of trousers, and was sitting unconcernedly rocking when the sentry returned and opened the door. Soon I saw the soldiers coming in, begrimed and fagged out, showing that the garrison had manned the eastern battery. Sponges and rammers were brought in, and I noticed that they were all for muzzle-loading guns. In vain I looked to see any gear from a breech-loader. The two guns nearest the Morro on the Socapa were breech-loaders, which appeared to be about 6-inch, carrying the regular ship form of shield, and I concluded that they had been taken from the starboard side of the Mercedes. The guns on the slope of Socapa were so well concealed that it was difficult to determine just what guns they were. One, high up, had its barrel extending beyond a mask of brush and seemed to be a 4-inch. The main point with these guns, however, was their position, and after the continued observation, I believed I could lead an assaulting party to them even on a dark night. The kitchen, being on an exposed side, had been abandoned during the bombardment, and luncheon was late. Well satisfied with the morning's experience, I had a ravenous appetite, and thought the rice and frijoles excellent. I found, in course of time, that an appetite was the most difficult feature connected with the full appreciation of this ration. As the attendant brought the pans up, he stooped and picked up something from the threshold. "What is this?" he asked. It was a piece of shell that had struck the door and fallen. I put it in my box, and asked him if my men were all right. He said they were, but that 5 men had been wounded in the Morro. Footnote. I learned afterward that 2 of these men died. As to the firing on the Morro, I was informed by the admiral, after exchange, that he had directed the Morro to be spared, believing that the prisoners were there. Apparently the gunners simply could not resist such a target. My men told me afterward that as soon as the bombardment began, the Spaniards hoisted a big Spanish flag on the lightning rod over my cell, which my men could see from their cell. The regular flagpole is on the other side of the fort, and so far as I could learn, a flag had not been hoisted on the lightning rod before and was not afterward. Evidently the shots that kept passing over my head were efforts to bring down the flag, and it was probably one of those that killed the men. End of footnote. It appeared to me as rather singular that the Morro should not have been taken up as a principal target. Perhaps the other work had been enough for one time, and the Morro was reserved for another. Thinking over the matter during luncheon, I determined to make a protest against our retention in the Morro, and with the pencil and part of the paper left by the judge, wrote an official letter to General Linares, protesting against such abuse, particularly when he had informed the American admiral that we had been removed, and I sent a similar letter to the British consul, adding that personally the experience of the forenoon had been interesting and valuable. The afternoon passed. Toward sunset, a shot was fired from the eastern battery, and the garrison rushed out. But it was a false alarm. The sea in the caverns, which had all along made weird rumblings, resounded like the shock of a heavy projectile, and again until I went to sleep there would be the startling sensation of reopening the bombardment, which each time would require the reassurance of my reason that it was only the sea. About 10 or 11 o'clock my door was thrown open, and an officer appeared in boots and spurs, covered with mud, showing under the dim light carried by an orderly. "I have come," he said, "from General Linares, who has directed that the prisoners be transferred to Santiago to start at daylight tomorrow morning." "Very well," I replied. "Have my men informed, and we shall be ready." "The general wishes you to understand, however," the officer continued, "that this action is not due to your protest of this afternoon." I did not reply, but smiled to myself as the officer left. End of Part 3, Section 3.